The Battle of Vethra Prime lasted 6 days. Coalition forces surrounded the Vethrani homeworld with a fleet that represented the combined might of 15 species united against a common predator. The Vethrani fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction, throwing everything they had at the advancing forces in wave after wave of suicidal attacks. But desperation was not enough to overcome 40 years of human preparation and 3 months of coalition coordination. On the 7th day, the last Vethrani defensive station fell silent, and Admiral Minji Cho ordered the ceasefire that ended organized military resistance. But the war's conclusion brought questions that were harder to answer than any tactical problem Ambassador Yuna Park stood before. The reformed Galactic Concord to address the most difficult of those questions. What do we do with the Vethrani? The assembly chamber was packed with representatives from every coalition member and dozens of species who had watched the war unfold. With a mixture of horror and hope, we call for complete extermination, announced the Tarshin delegate, whose species had lost their closest evolutionary cousins to Vethrani harvesting. They are predators who cannot be reformed. Genocide is not justice, countered the Kellery representative. It would make us no better than them. The debate raged for hours as species argued from every possible perspective. Some demanded blood in exchange for blood. Others worried that destroying the Vethrani would create a power vacuum that could destabilize the galaxy. And a few quiet voices suggested that perhaps the Vethrani could be rehabilitated over time. Yuna listened to every argument and considered the weight of the decision before her. Humanity had started this war, and humanity had led the coalition to victory. Now the galaxy looked to humanity for guidance on what came next. She thought about the processing facilities and the preserved specimens of consumed civilizations. She thought about the 17 species who had been erased from existence to feed Vethrani expansion, and she thought about the Vethrani children who had been born into their culture of predation and knew nothing else. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced impossible choices and found a way through. I propose a third option, she said. The assembly fell silent. Complete destruction of the Vethrani would satisfy our anger but serve no one. Yuna began, and it would set a precedent that might one day be used against any species deemed too dangerous by its neighbors. She paused to let that thought settle. But we cannot simply release them and hope they have learned their lesson. She continued, the Vethrani culture is built on predation, and that culture would inevitably produce new threats if left unchecked. Then what do you propose? The Carethian observer asked. Yuna activated a holographic display showing a detailed plan that human diplomats and strategists had spent weeks developing. Permanent quarantine of all Vethrani populations on their homeworld and 2 designated colony planets. She said, strict limitations on population growth and technology development, continuous monitoring by a coalition peacekeeping force, and mandatory cultural reform programs designed to eliminate predatory ideology over generations. You would imprison an entire species? The Morath commander asked with something like respect in his voice. We would contain a threat while giving future generations of Vethrani the chance to become something other than what their ancestors made them. Yuna replied, this is not mercy, and it is not revenge. She looked out at the assembled representatives of 300 species. This is responsibility, she said. The Vethrani exist because the galaxy allowed them to exist. Because species saw warning signs and chose not to act. Because it was easier to believe the mask than to question what lay beneath. Her voice hardened. We are all responsible for the civilizations they consumed, and we will all share responsibility for ensuring they never consume another. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Yuna Protocol, as history would call it, passed with the support of 247 species. The Vethrani collective would survive, but only as a contained and monitored population whose very existence would serve as a reminder of what happened when predators were allowed to flourish unchecked. 6 months later, Ambassador Una Park stood on the surface of Vethra Prime before a memorial that had not existed when the war began. The monument was simple but vast. A wall of polished stone stretching for kilometers with the names of every species the Vethrani had consumed carved into its surface. Beside each name was a symbol chosen by surviving relatives or coalition, historians to represent what had been lost. Una walked along the wall and paused at the newest section, where human workers had just finished carving the final name, the Sithrani, whose preserved specimens she had helped recover from the processing facility, and whose surviving cultural artifacts were being catalogued for eventual display in a museum dedicated to remembering what the Vethrani had taken from the galaxy. A young Carethian diplomat approached her, one of a new generation of observers who had been inspired by humanity's example to take a more active role in galactic affairs. Ambassador Park, the young Carethian said, "May I ask you a question?" "Of course," Una replied. "Humanity has gone from minor species to founding member of the new Concord Security Council in less than a year." The diplomat said, "You have more influence now than species that have been in the Concord for millennia." The young being paused as if unsure how to phrase the next part. What does humanity want from this position of power? Una considered the question as she looked up at the stars that burned cold and distant against the darkening sky of Vethra Prime. For 47 years, humanity had pretended to be humble newcomers while secretly preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Now that Mask had fallen as surely as the Vethranis had fallen, and the galaxy saw humanity for what it truly was, a species that would not flinch when threatened, a species that would fight not only for itself but for others, a species that would accept the burden of power if that power could protect the innocent. We want what we have always wanted. Una finally answered. She turned to face the young diplomat directly. We want to make sure that when the next mask falls, someone is ready to answer. She looked back at the memorial wall with its thousands of names representing millions of lives lost to Vethrani predation. And next time, she added quietly, they will not have to answer alone. The young Carethian considered this response for a long moment. That is a heavy burden to carry. The diplomat observed. Una nodded. It is, she agreed. But humanity did not ask for a far galaxy without burdens. She placed her hand against the cold stone of the memorial. We asked for a galaxy where those burdens are shared. Above them, the stars continued to burn as they had for billions of years, indifferent to the civilizations that rose and fell beneath their light. But somewhere among those stars, in council chambers and military academies and diplomatic offices across the galaxy, representatives of 300 species were learning a lesson that the Vethrani had taught without intending to. The galaxy was not safe. Predators lurked in shadows and behind masks of friendship. But now there was something new in the galaxy. As well, there was a species that had seen the predators and refused to look away. A species that had prepared in secret and struck without hesitation. A species that would stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Humanity had not asked for this role, but they would not flinch from it either, and that made all the difference. 3 months into the war, Lieutenant Commander Hiram Beek led her Special Operations Team through the corridors of a Vethrani facility. On the moon of Vethra, 6 intelligence reports had identified this place as a processing center. But no one had prepared them for what they would find inside. Commander Sergeant Jinho whispered as they reached the central chamber. You need to see this. Hiram moved forward and stopped cold at the sight before her. The chamber stretched for hundreds of meters, its walls lined with preservation pods containing specimens from species she had never seen. Tall beings with feathered wings frozen in expressions of terror, squat creatures with multiple eyes who seemed to have been captured mid-scream, children of species she could not identify, preserved like trophies in a collector's gallery. recording everything, she said into her helmet communicator. Command, are you receiving this feed? Director Kang's voice crackled through the secure channel. We see it. Commander, he replied, and even his controlled tone carried a hint of horror. Proceed with documentation. Hiron walked through the gallery of consumed civilizations with her team while their helmet cameras captured everything. Each pod bore a label in the Vethrani language, and her translator struggled to keep up. The Sithrani. She read from one label. Harvested in the year 4847 by Concord reckoning. She checked her historical database and felt her stomach turn. That's the species the Concord listed as mysteriously extinct. She reported. Disappeared without explanation 500 years ago. Not mysterious anymore. Jinho muttered. They continued through the facility and found more than preserved specimens. There were research labs where Vethrani scientists had studied their victims, searching for biological compounds and genetic material that could benefit the collective. There were storage vaults filled with cultural artifacts stripped from conquered worlds, displayed with the casual indifference of a museum dedicated to dead things. And at the center of the facility, they found the processing chambers. Hiron did not describe what she saw there. She simply recorded it and forwarded the footage to Command with a single notation. Evidence of harvesting methodology confirmed. Director Kang reviewed the footage in the command center, beneath Earth, and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 37 years of cold strategic planning. Rage. Broadcast this to the Concord, he ordered. Full distribution to all member species. Sir. His communications officer hesitated. The imagery is extremely disturbing. Good, Kang replied. They need to be disturbed. The broadcast hit the galactic networks within the hour, and the response was everything Kang had hoped for species that had remained neutral in the conflict demanded. Explanations from Vethrani representatives, governments that had discouraged their citizens from supporting human military efforts now faced public outrage, and 3 more species formally joined the coalition against the Vethrani collective. But the enemy was not idle deep in Vethrani space. The Inner Council convened in chambers that had not been used for emergency sessions in 2,000 years. The humans advanced faster than projected. High Counselor Verith announced to her colleagues, Our 4 defensive lines have collapsed, and the coalition fleet approaches the outer perimeter of our core systems. How is this possible? Demanded Counselor Sithax. We spent decades preparing for human resistance, and they were supposed to be isolated and desperate. Our intelligence was compromised. Verith replied with cold fury. Everything we learned about humanity was a lie designed to make us overconfident. The council sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the impossible reality of their situation. For 6,000 years, the Vethrani had been the hidden masters of galactic civilization, consuming species at their leisure while maintaining a facade of benevolence. Now they faced extinction at the hands of a species they had dismissed as simple and naive. We must negotiate. Councilor Tharan suggested. Offer the humans a withdrawal from their space in exchange for peace. They will not accept, Verith said. I have studied their communications, and they do not fight for survival alone. Then what do they fight for? Sithax demanded. Verith hesitated before answering. They fight for the species we have not yet consumed, she said. They consider themselves protectors of future victims. The council exchanged looks of disbelief. That makes no sense, Tharan said. Why would any species risk itself for others it has never met? Because they are insane, Sithax suggested. No, Verith replied slowly. Because they are something we never anticipated. She brought up human communications intercepts on the council chamber displays. Listen to what their leaders tell their soldiers, she said. The recording played, showing Fleet Admiral Minji Cho addressing her crews before a major assault. We do not fight because the Vethrani threatened us, Cho said. We fight because if we do not stop them now, they will consume others after us. Species who may never know the danger until it is too late. Civilizations who deserve the chance to grow and thrive without predators. Lurking in false friendship, her voice hardened with conviction. We fight for everyone the Vethrani would have taken from this galaxy. And we will not stop until they can never threaten another species again. The recording ended, and the Vethrani Council sat in silence. They are not fighting a war of survival, Vareth said. They are fighting a war of principle. How do we defeat an enemy who fights for something other than self-interest? Tharn asked. No one had an answer on the bridge of the Coalition flagship. Admiral Cho received the latest tactical updates with satisfaction. The Vethrani defensive perimeter was crumbling faster than projected. Weakened by defections from vassal species who had seen the evidence of harvesting and decided they wanted no part of it. Admiral, her communications officer reported, "We're receiving a transmission from the Vethrani Inner Council." On screen, Cho ordered the face of High Counselor Vareth appeared. Her silver-blue skin pale with what might have been fear. Admiral Cho, Vareth began. The Inner Council wishes to discuss terms. Terms? Cho repeated. We propose a cessation of hostilities, Vareth said. The Vethrani Collective will withdraw all forces from human space and provide reparations for our previous infiltration. And in exchange? Vareth hesitated. In exchange, you will halt your advance and allow the Collective to continue its existence. Cho considered the offer for exactly 3 seconds. Counselor, your proposal might have interested us if you had made it before we discovered your processing facilities, she said. But you did not only target humanity. We can provide information about other infiltration networks. Vareth offered quickly. Species we have targeted but not yet harvested. You could warn them. We already know about them, Cho replied. Your communications have not been secure for 3 decades. The Wrath's face showed something that might have been despair. Then what do you want? She demanded Cho lean forward in her command chair. We want you to understand something that your species has never grasped in 6,000 years of predation, she said. When you threatened humanity, you did not simply make an enemy. She paused to let the words sink in. You showed us what you truly are. And we decided that a galaxy with the Vethrani in it is not a galaxy we are willing to accept. The transmission ended. And Cho turned to her bridge crew. Set course for the Vethra system, she ordered. It's time to finish this. Director Kang watched the exchange from Earth and felt a cold satisfaction. The Vethrani had made one critical error when they selected humanity for harvest. They assumed that all species were like them, motivated by survival and self-interest above all else. They never considered that some species might fight for something greater than themselves, and that miscalculation would cost them everything. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was the largest gathering of species representatives. In 300 years, delegates from every corner of civilized space packed the Grand Assembly hall while billions more watched through broadcast networks. Ambassador Unipark stood at the central podium and faced judgment from the galaxy. Ambassador Park, the presiding arbiter, announced, a crystalline being from a species whose name could not be pronounced by human tongues. You stand accused of murdering High Speaker Tervaxis during a sacred diplomatic ceremony and initiating unprovoked military aggression against the Vethrani Collective. Yuna remained calm despite the weight of 300 species staring at her. I accept responsibility for killing Tervaxis, she replied. But I reject the accusation that our response was unprovoked. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The Vethrani admitted their intentions before the entire Concord. Yuna continued. They revealed that humanity was selected for harvesting and expected us to surrender without resistance. And your response was immediate violence, the arbiter noted. Many delegates find this excessive. Excessive? Yuna repeated the word with controlled anger. The Vethrani announced their plan to consume our entire species, and you call our defense excessive? She activated a holographic display that showed images from the intelligence humanity had gathered over decades. Let me show you what Vethrani harvesting actually means. The images were horrifying. Processing facilities were captured. Species were rendered into biological components. For Vethrani consumption, worlds stripped of all life to fuel the collective's expansion, records of 17 civilizations that had disappeared from the galaxy after being uplifted by their benevolent Vethrani sponsors. These are not accusations, Yuna said as delegates recoiled from the displays. These are records from Vethrani archives that we access through their own infiltration network. The assembly erupted into chaos as species that had trusted that the Teos did the Vethrani for millennia demanded answers, but other voices rose in opposition, regardless of Vethrani intentions, announced the representative of the Morath hegemony, a militaristic species that had always viewed humanity with suspicion. Your actions have destabilized the entire galactic order. We call for immediate sanctions against human space, added the delegate from the Sith Confederation, and the surrender of Ambassador Park to face trial. Yuna stood her ground as accusations flew from every direction. Some species demanded justice for the Vethrani, while others called for humanity to be quarantined as a dangerous and unpredictable civilization. The noise grew until a single voice cut through the chaos with the weight of ancient authority. Enough. Every being in the assembly fell silent and turned toward the upper galleries where the Korethian observer had risen from its seat for the first time in 2 centuries. Korethians were the oldest known species in the galaxy, beings of pure energy who had watched civilizations rise and fall since before most current species had evolved beyond single-celled organisms. Their observer attended Concord meetings, but never spoke and never voted. Until now, we have watched the Vethrani for 6,000 years. The observer announced in a voice that resonated through every mind in the chamber, regardless of language or biology. And we have suspected their true nature for nearly as long. Shock rippled through the assembly. You knew? The arbiter demanded. We suspected, the observer clarified, but we lacked proof sufficient to act. And the Concord does not permit action based on suspicion alone. The ancient being turned its attention to Yuna. Humanity has provided that proof, the observer continued. And more importantly, humanity has demonstrated something we have not seen in 10,000 years of galactic history. What is that? Yuna asked. The courage to act, the observer replied, and the wisdom to prepare. The being moved through the assembly hall like flowing light, drawing every eye as it descended to the central podium. For millennia, we have watched young species face the Vethrani's hidden predation, the observer said. Some surrendered when the mask fell. Others fought and lost because they learned the truth too late. But none have ever done what humanity has done. And what is that? The Morath representative demanded with contempt. You saw the trap before it closed, the observer said, addressing Yuna directly. You prepared in secret while maintaining the illusion of ignorance. And when the moment came, you struck with precision that should not have been possible. The observer paused and seemed to study humanity's ambassador with new appreciation. We have waited long for a species with both the perception to see and the courage to act, the observer announced to the full assembly. The Korethians formally recognize humanity's right to defend itself against Vethrani predation. The silence that followed was absolute. Korethian recognition carried weight that no other endorsement could match. Furthermore, the observer continued, we call upon all species who have been targeted by Vethrani infiltration to examine our evidence and determine for themselves whether humanity fights alone or with allies. The Marth representative sputtered in outrage but found no words to counter the authority of the oldest voice in the galaxy. Eunice seized the moment. The Vethrani did not target only humanity, she announced. Our intelligence indicates that at least 12 current Concord members have active Vethrani infiltration networks preparing them for eventual harvest. She transmitted files to every delegation in the assembly. We are sharing everything we know. Eunice said, not to gain allies through obligation, but because every species deserves to know if predators are lurking among them. The assembly erupted again. But this time, the anger was directed at the Vethrani and their suspected collaborators. Delegates demanded immediate investigations, while others called for military action. In the chaos, Una received a private communication from Director Kang. Well done, Ambassador, his message read. The first coalition members are already reaching out through back channels. Una allowed herself a small moment of hope. Humanity could not defeat the Vethrani collective alone. But they did not need to fight alone within hours of the assembly's conclusion. 3 species had formally requested military coordination with human forces: the Kalori, an aquatic species whose homeworld showed signs of early Vethrani infiltration; the Tarshin, insectoid beings who had lost a sister species to mysterious extinction 2 millennia ago and now suspected Vethrani involvement; and most surprisingly, the Marth hegemony, whose military leaders had examined the evidence and concluded that humanity's strategic capabilities made them more valuable as allies than enemies. Ambassador Park received each delegation personally and made the same promise to all of them. We fight not only for ourselves, she said, but for every species the Vethrani would consume after us. A noble sentiment. The Marth commander replied with grudging respect. But can you truly defeat an enemy this ancient? Eunice smiled, and there was no diplomacy in that expression. They spent 47 years studying humanity, she said, and they still did not understand us. She gestured to the stars beyond the observation window. Now they will learn what that misunderstanding costs. The war had begun with a single gunshot in a diplomatic hall. Now it would spread across the galaxy as species who had lived in fear of shadows finally found the courage to step into the light, and at the front of that advancing light stood humanity, a species young and small by galactic standards, but possessed of something the Vethrani had never anticipated: the absolute refusal to be prey. 37 years earlier, a young intelligence analyst named Seo-Jun Kang sat in a basement office in Seoul and stared at data that made no sense. The Vethrani had been humanity's greatest benefactors since first contact, sharing technology and opening doors to galactic trade that should have taken centuries to access. But Seo-Jun had noticed patterns that others missed: small inconsistencies in Vethrani behavior that accumulated over years into something that looked very much like a predator studying its prey. He brought his findings to his superiors, and they laughed at him, so he went higher and higher still, until he found himself standing before a secret council of Earth's most powerful leaders with evidence that their alien friends were planning to devour human civilization. They did not laugh. Instead, they created a new agency with no official name and gave Seo-Jun unlimited resources and a single mission: learn everything about the Vethrani without letting them know that humanity had seen through their mask. Now, 37 years later, Director Seo-Jun Kang stood in the command center beneath the Antarctic ice and watched the culmination of his life's work unfold across dozens of holographic displays. Sector 7 neutralization complete, reported a young officer at a nearby console. All identified agents eliminated or captured. Sector 12 reports the same, another officer added: Seo-Jun. nodded and clasped his hands behind his back as he studied the tactical overview the Vethrani had planted over 4,000 sleeper agents across human space over the decades, embedded in governments and corporations and military installations where they could gather intelligence and prepare for the day of harvest. What the beast Vethrani did not know was that humanity had identified every single one of them within the first 15 years, rather than expose them. Sejun had decided to let them stay. He turned their own network against them, feeding them carefully curated false information while extracting genuine intelligence from their communications with the Vethrani homeworld for 22 years. The Vethrani believed they were learning humanity's deepest secrets, while in truth, they were learning only what Sejun wanted them to know: the real military installations were hidden. The true fleet positions were never recorded in any system the infiltrators could access, and the weapons humanity had developed in absolute secrecy would come as a very unpleasant surprise. "Director," a communications officer called out. "We have confirmation from Admiral Cho." Sejun moved to the main display where the face of Fleet Admiral Minji Cho appeared. Her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression carved from stone. "The Vethrani war fleet is holding position at the border," Cho reported. "They seem uncertain how to proceed. They expected a broken species begging for mercy," Sejun replied. "Instead, they found us waiting with a knife at their throat." Cho allowed herself a small smile. "Permission to cut?" she asked. "Granted," Sejun said. "Show them what happens when predators choose the wrong prey." The display shifted to show the tactical situation at the border. Between human space and Vethrani territory, the Vethrani had positioned a fleet of 300 warships to intimidate humanity into surrender, confident that their decades of infiltration had given them complete knowledge of human military capabilities. They were wrong from asteroid fields and hidden stations and positions masked by sensor jamming technology the Vethrani had never seen. Human warships emerged in numbers that should have been impossible. 200 vessels of various sizes, from nimble destroyers to massive dreadnoughts, appeared on scanners across the Vethrani fleet. Admiral Koth of the Vethrani watched his tactical displays with growing horror as he realized the scope of the deception. Every piece of intelligence his agents had gathered was worthless. Every assumption about human military strength was wrong. "This is Admiral Cho of the United Earth Defense Force," a transmission announced. "Across all Vethrani frequencies, your infiltration network has been neutralized and your fleet positions have been known to us for years." Koth gripped the arms of his command chair with all four hands. "What are your terms?" he demanded. "Terms?" Cho replied with genuine confusion in her voice. "Admiral, we are not here to negotiate." The human fleet opened fire at the Galactic Concord Summit Station. Ambassador Yuna Park had barricaded herself in the human diplomatic quarters with her small security team while chaos raged through the station. Vethrani agents were hunting for her, but so were security forces from other species, some trying to arrest her for the assassination and others trying to protect her from Vethrani retaliation. Yuna ignored them all and focused on the communications console before her. "This is Ambassador Park, broadcasting to all Concord member species," she announced. "The information I am about to share has been verified by 37 years of intelligence gathering." She transmitted files that detailed every aspect of Vethrani predation, from their methods of infiltration to the fates of species they had consumed in the past. "The Vethrani do not uplift civilizations," she continued. "They cultivate them like livestock and harvest them when they are ready." Across the galaxy, representatives of 300 species received this transmission and began to examine the evidence with growing horror. Some had suspected the Vethrani for centuries but lacked proof. Others had trusted them completely and now felt the cold realization of betrayal. In the council chambers of the Corethian Observer, the ancient being who had watched galactic civilizations rise and fall for 10,000 years stirred from its meditative state and studied the human transmission with great interest. "Remarkable," the observer said to its attendants. "They knew and they waited and they prepared. Should we intervene, observer?" An attendant asked the Corethian, considered the question for a long moment. "Not yet," it replied. "Let us see what these humans do with their advantage." Back at the border, the Battle of First Blood was ending. The Vethrani fleet, caught completely off guard by weapons and tactics they had never seen, was being systematically destroyed. Admiral Koth managed to rally 60 of his ships into a defensive formation, but human forces surrounded them with cold efficiency. "Surrender and your crews will be treated as prisoners of war." Admiral Cho offered. Koth knew the Vethrani did not take prisoners. They only took prey. "You cannot defeat the collective," he replied with false confidence. "We have fleets and resources beyond your imagination." "We know exactly what you have," Cho said. "We've been reading your communications for 3 decades. She transmitted a file to Koth's display, and he watched in disbelief as detailed information about every Vethrani fleet colony and military installation scrolled across his screen. "You were so focused on learning our secrets," Cho continued, "that you never considered we might be learning yours." Koth's forehands trembled as he realized the full scope of the disaster. The infiltration that should have guaranteed Vethrani victory had instead given humanity complete knowledge of Vethrani vulnerabilities. "What do you want?" he asked. "We want you to send a message to your leaders," Cho replied. "Tell them that humanity is coming, and we will not stop until every world you have threatened is free from your predation." She paused, and her cold eyes seemed to look directly through the screen into Koth's soul. "Tell them the prey has become the hunter." In the command center beneath Earth, Director Sia-Jung Kang received reports of victory from the border and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 37 years of patience and planning had led to this moment, but he knew the war had only begun. The Vethrani collective controlled vast territories and possessed resources that dwarfed what humanity could muster alone. Winning this war would require more than military strength. It would require allies. He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a secure channel to Ambassador Park," he ordered. "It's time to show the galaxy what the Vethrani really are." The mask had fallen, humanity had not flinched, and now the true war would begin. Ambassador Yuna Park stood at the observation window of the Galactic Concord Summit Station and watched the stars burn cold and distant against the void of space. 47 years humanity had spent among the stars as a minor species, trading goods and offering mediation services to ancient civilizations that had traveled between worlds when humans still lived in caves. Today, all of that would change. The summit station hummed with activity as representatives from 300 species gathered in the Grand Assembly Hall for the most important ceremony in human history. Humanity was about to be inducted into the inner circle of the Galactic Concord. Yuna adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform and took a deep breath before entering the hall, where thousands of alien delegates waited in tiered seating that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with the symbols of every member species. At the center of the hall stood High Speaker Tovaxis of the Vethrani Collective, the ancient and revered species that had sponsored humanity's membership from the very beginning. The Vethrani resembled tall humanoids with silver-blue skin and eyes that shifted colors like oil on water. They had found humanity during their first fumbling attempts at interstellar travel and had guided them through the complex politics of galactic civilization with patience and what seemed like genuine affection. Tovaxis spread his forearms wide in a gesture of welcome as Yuna approached. The central platform, friends and honored delegates. Torvaxis announced in a voice that resonated through the hall's acoustic systems. We gather today to celebrate the ascension of our cherished human allies to the inner circle of the Concord. Applause rippled through the assembly in various forms. From the clicking mandibles of the insectoid Keth to the harmonic whistles of the gaseous Vomora, Una smiled and bowed her head in humble acknowledgement. She had practiced this moment for months, rehearsing every gesture and expression to convey proper gratitude without appearing weak. For nearly 5 decades, we Vethrani have watched humanity grow from curious explorers into valued members of our galactic community. Torvaxis continued, and now the time has come to reveal the full depth of our relationship. Something in his tone made Una's instincts flare with warning. She had survived 30 years in diplomatic service by trusting those instincts. You see, dear friends, Torvaxis said, as his oil-slick eyes fixed on Una with an expression that might have been a smile on a human face. Humanity was never simply a species we chose to uplift out of kindness. The hall fell silent. They were a species we selected for harvesting. Una did not move. She did not flinch. She simply listened as Torvaxis explained in calm and measured tones how the Vethrani had spent millennia perfecting their method of conquest. They did not wage wars or invade planets with fleets. Instead, they infiltrated young civilizations, posed as benefactors, studied every weakness and strength over generations, and then consumed them when the time was right. We have agents in every human colony, Torvaxis announced with pride as holographic displays appeared showing images of Vethrani operatives embedded in human governments, military installations, and corporate headquarters across all of human space. We know your fleet positions, your defense codes, your supply lines, and the names of your leaders' children. He turned to face the assembly, arms spread wide once more. This is not an act of cruelty, but one of nature, Torvaxis declared. The strong consume the weak, and humanity, for all their charm, has always been destined to feed the Vethrani collective. Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall as delegates processed this revelation. Some species looked horrified while others simply watched with the cold calculation of predators evaluating potential threats. Torvaxis turned back to Una with something like pity in his shifting eyes. We expect you to accept this gracefully. Ambassador, he said, your species has no secrets from us, no hidden strengths, no hope of resistance. He paused as if waiting for her to crumble. We recommend immediate and unconditional surrender. Una Park stood perfectly still for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then she reached into her ceremonial jacket, pulled out a compact plasma pistol that should never have passed the station's security scanners, aimed at Torvaxis, and fired twice. The high speaker of the Vethrani collective collapsed to the floor with 2 smoking holes where his hearts had been. The silence that followed was absolute. Una lowered her weapon and looked directly into the broadcast cameras that transmitted this ceremony to every corner of the galaxy. You should have studied us better, she said. Then chaos erupted. Vethrani delegates throughout the hall reached for hidden weapons while security forces from a dozen species scrambled to respond to the unprecedented assassination. But Una did not run or seek cover. She simply touched a device on her wrist and spoke 3 words, Protocol Midnight Sun, across human space. In every colony and station and ship, emergency alerts activated with perfect synchronization in the hidden command center beneath the Antarctic ice. Director Saijun Kang watched the broadcast with a grim smile on his weathered face and nodded to his staff. It's time, he said. Execute all contingencies. On the colony world of New Sol, teams of human operatives who had spent years pretending to be ordinary citizens emerged from hiding and moved with lethal precision toward targets they had identified long ago on Earth's orbital defense platforms. Commanders who had always known this day would come brought weapon systems online that the Vethrani had never seen because they had never truly existed in any database. The infiltrators could access in the halls of the Galactic Concord Summit Station. Ambassador Una Park walked calmly through the chaos toward the exit while Vethrani agents tried to stop her and failed because they did not know about the enhanced combat training that had been scrubbed from her official records. She paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembly one final time to all species present. She announced over the screaming and weapons fire, "Humanity has known the truth about the Vethrani for 37 years. The hall fell quiet again as delegates processed this impossible statement. We have been watching them while they watched us. Una continued, learning their methods while they thought they learned ours, and preparing for this moment while they assumed we were blind. She smiled, and it was not a diplomatic smile. The Vethrani wanted to know if humanity was worth harvesting. She said, now they will learn what it means to threaten the human race. The broadcast cameras captured every word and sent them racing across the stars to every corner of civilized space in the command center beneath Earth. Director Kang authorized the next phase of operations as reports flooded in from across human territory, the Vethrani. Sleeper agents were being neutralized with surgical precision. The operation would take 11 minutes, aboard the Vethrani war fleet that had positioned itself at the edge of human space to intimidate a broken and surrendering species. Admiral Koth received the broadcast and watched in disbelief as his entire intelligence network went dark. He had expected to accept humanity's surrender within the hour. Instead, he found himself facing a species that had somehow turned the greatest infiltration operation in Vethrani history into the greatest intelligence failure. A new transmission appeared on his screens, and he saw a human woman in military uniform with silver hair and cold eyes. This is Fleet Admiral Minji Cho of United Earth Defense Force. She announced, "You wanted to know if humanity was worth harvesting." Behind her, the displays showed human fleets emerging from positions the Vethrani had never detected, armed with weapons that had never appeared in any intelligence report. Allow us to demonstrate our value.